There is a version of this story in which the emperor of mankind is a bad father, and it's the version almost everyone tells. He lied to his sons. He withheld the truth. He treated 18 demigods as instruments rather than children, and when the structure he built collapsed into the worst civil war in the history of the species, the collapse was his fault, because a father who does not tell his children the truth has no right to be surprised when they are deceived by someone else. That version is emotionally satisfying. That version is also, when you actually examine the strategic position the emperor was in, wrong. The truth was that the warp is responsive to belief, that to tell a being about the chaos gods is, in a measurable and canonical sense, to feed the chaos gods. The truth was that the emperor was running a command structure of 20 legions across a galaxy with no secure communication, no faster-than-thought intelligence channel, and no way to control what any individual Primarch did with dangerous information once he had it. The truth was that the Primarchs were deployed into the Great Crusade before they were psychologically finished, scattered as infants, raised by 20 different worlds, returned to the emperor as adults he had never actually raised. And the truth was that there was no safe channel, no controlled environment, no trusted intermediary, no developmental window through which the actual metaphysical situation could be transmitted to 20 superhuman beings without some fraction of them doing something catastrophic with it. Given those four constraints, the emperor's information control policy wasn't a failure of love. It was a rational response to an unsolvable problem. But the policy had one failure mode. One. There was exactly one Primarch whose psychology was structured in such a way that the absence of religious truth wouldn't produce caution or confusion, but fabrication. A son who needed the sacred so badly that, denied the real thing, he would build a false one and pour a legion into it. The emperor knew which son. His name was Lorgar, and at a city called Monarchia, approximately 50 years before the Horus heresy, the emperor did the one thing guaranteed to turn that risk into the heresy. The channel's own comment section reached this debate and fractured cleanly. On one side, 164 likes defending the emperor's reasoning. The policy was sound given the strategic reality he faced. On the other, a single word, dropped like a stone. Lorgar. No argument, no elaboration, just the name. One commenter built a case. Another demolished it with a proper noun. Both of them were right. Neither of them finished the argument. The four-part framework that follows is synthesis, not scripture. Each constraint is canon-grounded, but their organization into a single defense is an argument, not a canonical document. The chaos gods aren't gods in any conventional sense. They are psychic entities formed from and sustained by the emotions and beliefs of every sentient being in the galaxy. When an emotion or faith in an entity grows strong enough across enough minds, it becomes one of the denizens of the warp. The strongest of these entities grow to such size that they can reach back into the material universe and demand more of the very thing that created them, more worship, more belief, more fear. Corn grows stronger with every act of rage and slaughter. Zinch feeds on ambition and the desire for change. Nurgle on despair and the acceptance of decay. Slanesh on excess and sensation. They are powered not by abstract malice but by mortal minds doing exactly what mortal minds do. This means the imperial truth, the emperor's galaxy-spanning program of secular rationalism, his explicit suppression of religion and superstition across every world the legions brought into compliance, was operational warfare, not ideology. Its purpose was to suppress wider knowledge of the warp's supernatural nature. The suppression of belief was the method. Starving the warp of emotional fuel was the objective. The Bad Father account assumes that telling the Primarchs the truth about chaos would have been neutral, better information, no consequence. The warp doesn't work that way. To brief 20 legions on the nature of the chaos gods, to name them, to describe their attributes, to explain their power, plants 20 seeds of exactly the kind of emotional engagement that makes them stronger. An army told that corn is real and drinks blood will produce, through fear alone, the very psychic discharge that empowers him. An army told that Tzeentch is real and manipulates fate will generate the anxious, scheming thoughts that feed him. The Emperor understood this. His stated position, drawn from the Master of Mankind, connected superstition directly to the warp's exploitation of mortal minds. That ignorance and submission were the mechanisms through which the warp's denizens operated. His solution was deliberate. Build a civilization that does not believe in the ruinous powers, and you deny them the raw psychic material on which they subsist. A precision matters here. The strongest version of the argument centers on belief and worship rather than conscious knowledge. Canon is clearest on the link between emotional investment and warp power, not mere awareness. But what the Emperor correctly foresaw was this. Telling 20 different Primarch psychologies about the chaos gods wouldn't produce 20 clinical, neutral responses. It would produce 20 different forms of intense, spiritually charged fascination, dread, or reverence, several of which would generate exactly the kind of focused engagement the warp converts into power. The risk wasn't the information. The risk was what 20 demigods would feel about it. The Great Crusade comprised 20 Space Marine legions operating simultaneously across the width of the galaxy. Each legion was commanded by a Primarch who, in operational terms, answered to no one except the Emperor himself and, after Ulanor, the War Master Horus. A Primarch wasn't obligated to take orders from anyone beneath that tier. The Crusade's vast scale made absolute knowledge a rare commodity. The Emperor and War Council couldn't verify what individual legions were actually doing in the field except through astropathic reports. Astropathic communication, the only mechanism for faster-than-light information transfer, wasn't secure. It routed through the warp itself. The most precise lore descriptions call these messages like bottles thrown into the sea of chaos, vulnerable to interception, to distortion, to the inherent unreliability of a medium the ruinous powers actively inhabited. The most sensitive intelligence in the Imperium moved through the exact enemy the Emperor was trying to fight. Build the scenario. The Emperor decides to brief his Primarchs on the true nature of the warp, the chaos gods, the demonic. He transmits this through the only available communication channel, one that routes through the warp, or he delivers it in person to 20 Primarchs scattered across a galaxy-spanning campaign, each operating with significant tactical independence. Then what? What mechanism existed to ensure Angron didn't decide to challenge Khorne directly? That Perturabo didn't attempt to weaponize warp mechanics against fortified positions? The Emperor wasn't in the field. After appointing Horus as War Master following the Ulanor Crusade, he returned to Terra to pursue the Webway project, an attempt to eliminate humanity's dependence on the warp for travel entirely. Malcador governed Terra's administration in his absence. The Custodes were primarily Terra-bound. There was no Emperor present to monitor 20 Primarchs processing dangerous information in real time, no secure back channel through which he could course correct if one of them moved in a catastrophic direction, and no organizational structure fast enough to respond to a Primarch-scale mistake before it became irreversible. Magnus the Red demonstrated exactly what this risk looked like. Without any chaos briefing, acting entirely on his own initiative and intellectual arrogance, Magnus pursued warp sorcery despite the explicit prohibition issued at the Council of Nicaea. When he tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, he projected himself through the Emperor's Webway project, destroyed the anti-chaos wards protecting it, and caused a catastrophic breach. He knew the rules. He broke them anyway. Give that same Primarch a detailed briefing on the actual metaphysical stakes of the war, and the honest assessment is that it accelerates his research rather than containing it. The information control policy wasn't the Emperor failing to trust his sons. It was the Emperor correctly recognizing that 20 independent demigods with no controllable communication infrastructure, operating across a galaxy he wasn't present to supervise, represented a strategic system that couldn't safely distribute the knowledge he was withholding. The standard objection to the entire defense runs like this. The Emperor should have raised the Primarchs differently. He should have built the truth into their formation, shaped their psychology to handle it, created in them an immunity to deception by ensuring the deception was never possible. This objection is emotionally compelling and chronologically impossible. The Primarchs were scattered as infants by chaos intervention before the Great Crusade began. They weren't lost for a year and then recovered. All 20 were recovered throughout the course of the Great Crusade itself, which means the campaign was already in motion before the Emperor had found most of them. There was no pre-Crusade window during which he could have gathered his sons and prepared them for the truth. They arrived as adults. Each Primarch was shaped by the world that caught him. Leman Russ by the pre-industrial killing fields of Fenris. Robute Gilliman by the administrative and martial traditions of Macragge. Corvus Corax by the slave mines and resistance movements of Deliverance. By the time the Emperor found each of them, they were finished personalities. Not blank slates waiting for his instruction, but fully formed men whose fundamental natures had been forged by decades of alien conditions. Lorgar arrived already a prophet. On Colchis, a feudal world where religious and secular life were indistinguishable, Lorgar had unified a planet through religious civil war before the Emperor's fleet arrived. He had preached the coming of a savior god. He had built the core of a spiritual architecture so complete that the Emperor's arrival confirmed his prophecy rather than challenged it. Cor Phaeron, the zealot priest who raised Lorgar from infancy, had shaped him deliberately, comprehensively, and long before the Emperor had any developmental access to him. The window for shaping a Primarch's fundamental psychology toward safe metaphysical knowledge was the period before those personalities were formed. That window closed before the Great Crusade started.
The Emperor didn't raise the Primarchs. He inherited them. Every version of the "he should have told them" argument assumes there was a way to tell them, a mechanism, a process, some institutional structure through which the Emperor could have delivered controlled, accurate metaphysical truth to 20 Primarchs without the information cascading unpredictably in 20 different directions. That mechanism wasn't there. Malcador the Sigillite was the Emperor's closest advisor and the most trusted individual in the Imperium. Ancient even by the standards of the age, a psyker of extraordinary power, credited with founding the embryonic organizations that would eventually become the Inquisition, an institution that explicitly didn't exist yet during the Great Crusade. Malcador was one being, terra-bound, managing the administration of an expanding galactic empire.
He couldn't simultaneously travel to 20 Primarchs spread across the galaxy to deliver individually calibrated metaphysical briefings.
And even if he could, each briefing would have landed in a different psychology with no means to monitor the results. No Inquisition equivalent existed during the Great Crusade. No organization had the remit, the reach, or the institutional knowledge to manage controlled disclosure of dangerous metaphysical truth to Legion-level command structures across an entire galaxy. The Emperor had the Webway Project, the Custodes, the Sigillite, and the command structures of the Legions themselves, none of which constituted a safe delivery mechanism for the information he was withholding. The Bad Father argument silently imagines a scenario in which the Emperor had a clean option and chose not to use it. The actual scenario is one in which that option didn't exist. Judging him for not doing something that wasn't available to him isn't historical analysis. It's moral projection backward onto a problem that had no clean solution.
2 other Primarchs fell, and both matter here, but not as indictments of the policy. Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children, was corrupted through the Layer Blade, an artifact containing a chaos entity that he retrieved from an alien temple on Laren and refused to relinquish. His corruption required no information vacuum. It required a weapon and a flaw, his obsession with perfection, exploited by an entity that whispered the right promises into that specific weakness. The policy's suppression of chaos knowledge created none of Fulgrim's vulnerability. Without the blade, the canonical assessment is that he likely wouldn't have fallen at all. Magnus is the more complex case and the more important one. He proves the policy's general soundness by failing despite it. Magnus didn't fall because the Emperor withheld information. He fell because of his own intellectual arrogance, pursuing warp sorcery against explicit prohibition, and ultimately destroying the Emperor's Webway project in an attempt to warn him about Horus. He had the rules. He broke them anyway. Magnus is proof that a Primarch who knew the dangers could still choose to court them through personal failing, not policy failure. Lorgar is neither of these things. His fall required no external artifact and no violation of rules he'd been given. It required only an empty void where his psychology demanded meaning, and someone waiting in that void to fill it. The comment that answered the Emperor's defense with a single word was correct. Lorgar was the one son for whom the policy wasn't just difficult. It was, given who he was, nearly certain to backfire. Lorgar Aurelian wasn't simply religious. He was constitutively religious in a way that set him apart from every other son the Emperor had.
Fiercely religious, prone to fanaticism.
These descriptors follow him through every account of his pre-heresy character. The first heretic establishes the core of it. Lorgar needed the sacred the way other beings need oxygen. Zealotry wasn't a personality quirk. It was the foundational architecture of everything he was. The idea of him existing without an object of worship, without a transcendent frame for his existence, without a higher truth to preach and embody, that wasn't psychologically available to him. He'd been shaped this way from infancy. Cor Pharon found him, raised him, educated him in the ancient religious traditions of Colchis, and used him as a weapon in a planetary religious war, all before the Emperor arrived. By the time Lorgar joined the Great Crusade, his entire selfhood was organized around worship. He had written what would later become the Lectitio Divinitatis, the foundational text of the imperial cult.
He had converted entire populations through oratory alone. He had built shrine worlds. He had renamed his legion from the imperial heralds to the word bearers to reflect their true function as missionaries of the sacred. The Emperor was his god.
For almost a century of the Great Crusade, 100,000 word-bearers built cathedrals on every world they conquered, converted populations to the worship of the emperor as a divine being, and carried out compliance missions at a fraction of the pace of other legions, because the spiritual work of conversion took longer than the military work of conquest. Lorgar believed with the fullness of everything he had. The saddest footnote: he eventually succeeded. Thousands of worlds now pray in unison for the god emperor, singing liturgies Lorgar wrote 10,000 years ago. The church he built outlasted his own devotion by 10 millennia and counting. The imperial truth's suppression of religion was aimed directly at what Lorgar was, not at him specifically, but at the architecture of his entire selfhood. If the emperor maintained the policy across all 20 legions with no exceptions, Lorgar faced an impossible choice: continue believing in a god who denied his own divinity and had explicitly forbidden such belief, or find something else to believe in. Given Lorgar's psychology, there was no third option. Agnosticism wasn't available to him. The void where faith had been wouldn't stay empty. The emperor understood this. His rebuke at Monarchia was targeted and specific, not a general statement about religious practice, but a direct, personalized confrontation with Lorgar's particular mode of devotion. Whatever the limits of what can be known about his internal reasoning at that moment, he clearly understood enough about Lorgar to know exactly what he was correcting.
Which means what happened at Monarchia wasn't a failure of understanding. It was something worse. Approximately 50 years before the Horus heresy formally began, the emperor issued orders. The entire Ultramarines Legion, accompanied by a force of Legio Custodes and Malcador the Sigillite himself, was dispatched to the planet Kur. Their objective was the capital city, Monarchia, called the Perfect City by the word-bearers who had transformed it into a monument to their faith. Cathedrals, devotional monuments dedicated to the worship of the emperor as god. The intense religious life of its citizenry organized entirely around that devotion. The city had been brought into imperial compliance 103 years before the events at Istvan V. Decades of building, decades of spiritual cultivation, the physical embodiment of everything the word-bearers had fought and preached for. The population was given notice to evacuate. Then, the Ultramarines raised Monarchia from orbit. A distress call was allowed to be sent. A single astropathic message from the people of Kur reaching the word-bearers mid-campaign. The entire 17th Legion, 100,000 Space Marines, redirected to the planet. They arrived to find smoldering ruins. Malcador was there. Lorgar confronted him, demanded explanation, and in his rage struck the Sigillite, sent him skidding 20 meters across the ash, cracking bones that should have been lethal impacts in a normal man. The emperor himself descended. What followed is confirmed across multiple sources. The emperor psychically forced every member of the word-bearers legion, including Lorgar himself, to kneel in the dust of Monarchia. 100,000 Space Marines brought to their knees in the ruins of their greatest achievement. The emperor told them they had failed him and failed humanity, that he was no god and would suffer no such belief in his realm, that Lorgar clung to ancient perceptions and endangered everything with them, that Lorgar was a general, not a high priest. Then the emperor departed. Robute Guilliman remained. He made a remark Lorgar took as condescension. Lorgar struck him in the chest with his ceremonial mace, splitting Guilliman's breastplate. Guilliman dismissed it as a tantrum and left. The word-bearers returned to their landing ships. Lorgar stayed kneeling in the ash after his legion had risen, and had to be physically lifted to his feet by two of his captains. Examine what happened. not emotionally but structurally. The Emperor had a known failure mode in his information control policy. A Primarch whose entire psychology was organized around worship, and who would, without a sacred object, construct a new one. He understood Lorgar well enough to target his specific mode of devotion with precision. He understood what the word-bearers were doing and why. He understood that Lorgar's faith in him as a god was the core of the problem.
What he did with that understanding was destroy the faith without replacing it with anything. He didn't take Lorgar aside. He didn't provide a private explanation, an alternative framework, a different mission that could satisfy the part of Lorgar that needed transcendent purpose without generating the theological crisis he was about to cause. He destroyed the city publicly, forced the Legion to kneel publicly, delivered a rebuke that explained what Lorgar had done wrong without offering any path toward doing right differently, and left. No source records the Emperor offering Lorgar a substitute framework, private acknowledgement, or managed transition away from faith. The pattern of the Emperor's behavior across the entire Great Crusade was discipline, control, and information management. Monarchia broke that pattern. His policy was control. Monarchia was the opposite, humiliation deployed where management was required. The choice of the Ultramarines carries its own weight. The Emperor selected the Legion that was, in every measurable way, the word-bearer's mirror and shadow. Successful where the word-bearers were slow, celebrated where the word-bearers were criticized, the living embodiment of what Lorgar's Legion could have been. Forcing the word-bearers to kneel before Guilliman wasn't just a military lesson. It was designed to sting. The enmity Lorgar carried toward Guilliman after Monarchia ran for the rest of the heresy. At Calth, they swore at each other with a venom that traced directly back to those ruins. That degree of attention to the specific psychological impact of the punishment isn't consistent with the Emperor missing what the punishment would do to Lorgar. He understood. He chose. What Monarchia produced was a Lorgar with his faith destroyed, his god refusing divinity, and a void where his entire psychological architecture demanded meaning. That void didn't stay empty.
The canonical characterization is precise. It seems likely that Lorgar's fall began after Monarchia, that the dark powers of the warp reached out to him in his moment of doubt and offered him that which the Emperor had denied him, a higher power to believe in. Cor Pharon, who had raised Lorgar on Colchis and was steeped in the old faith, and Erebus counseled Lorgar in the aftermath. They told him the old religions of the galaxy weren't false, that all the varied belief systems of countless human cultures pointed toward a common origin, a shared metaphysical truth, that the gods the Emperor denied were real and could be found. They guided Lorgar toward the pilgrimage, a concept drawn from the mythological traditions of Colchis, a journey to the place where gods and mortals meet. Roughly 40 years before the Horus heresy formally began, the word-bearers rejoined the Great Crusade as a front. Lorgar traveled to Cadia, at the edge of the Eye of Terror.
There, a native of Cadia named Ingefell was elevated by the chaos entities waiting within the Eye into something beyond mortal. Ingefell the Ascended, and guided a chapter of the word-bearers into the Eye itself. The Serrated Sun chapter, Into the Great Eye. What they found was the primordial truth, the revelation that the chaos gods were real, that the warp was fundamental reality, that the Emperor's imperial truth was a deliberate lie, and that humanity's survival required not the denial of chaos but its embrace. Lorgar emerged transformed. He ordered Cadia bombarded afterward so that no one else could stumble upon the secret. He had gone in with an empty void where his faith had been. He came out with 4 new gods, and unlike the Emperor, They were willing to be worshipped back. For 40 years after the pilgrimage, the word-bearers wore a false face of loyalty. They seeded warrior lodges in other legions. They cultivated chaos cults on compliant worlds. They positioned the apparatus of what would become the heresy while appearing to be the most militarily productive legion in the crusade. Lorgar had his missionaries all along. He simply changed what they were preaching. At the critical moment, the word-bearers corrupted the war master Horus on Davin in a scheme Lorgar himself had orchestrated. The heresy's ignition ran through the word-bearers. It traced back through the pilgrimage to Monarchia. The policy didn't do that. The exception to the policy did that. Return to the comments section. The two positions. 164 likes on the Emperor's defense. One word, Lorgar, dropped as a rebuttal. The Emperor was right to keep the secret.
Across 4 constraints. A warp that feeds on the very knowledge of it. A command structure with no secure way to control that knowledge. A generation of sons recovered too late to be shaped by the truth, and no institution anywhere capable of safely delivering it. The information control policy wasn't a failure of love. It was the rational response to a problem with no clean solution. But the policy had one failure mode, and the Emperor knew its name. Lorgar Aurelian needed the sacred the way other beings need air. Denied the true faith, he would build a false one, and the Emperor understood that better than anyone alive, which is what makes Monarchia not a tragedy, but an error. Faced with the one son for whom his policy was lethal, the Emperor didn't manage the risk. He humiliated it. He razed Lorgar's city, broke Lorgar's faith in front of another legion, and left the void where Lorgar's whole psychology demanded meaning. And chaos was waiting in exactly that void.
So when the comment section answers the Emperor's defense with a single word, Lorgar, the answer is correct. And it's also incomplete. Lorgar was never proof that the secret should have been told. Lorgar was proof that the secret needed one exception, carefully made, by the one being who understood him. The Emperor identified that son correctly, and then handled him worse than he handled anyone. The heresy didn't begin because the Emperor kept a secret. It began because, with the one son the secret would kill, he chose humiliation over a father's care, and never understood that the difference was the whole war. Subscribe for more stories like this.